Today's topic is globalization. It's preposterous for me to speak about it in the presence of the world's leading thinker about globalization, but I will. And I will divide my remarks into 4 parts. First, I want to say some words about the division of the world into separate states and peoples, which is, of course, the fundamental premise of this discussion. Second, about the recent history of globalization from the middle of the 19th century to today. Third, I want to contrast the present direction of globalization to another possible direction. And finally, I want to make some remarks about Danny Roderick's celebrated trilemma of globalization. So first, on the division of the world into peoples and into states. The division of humanity into separate peoples under the shield of armed states is necessary to the development of the powers and possibilities of mankind. Humanity develops its potential only by developing it in different directions. And if these directions are not embodied in institutional arrangements, not just in culture and habits, they're not for real. They're not deep cutting. So this is necessary to the development of humanity. But we pay for it a terrible price. And the price is the possibility of war among these armed states. So either we have an empire, a world federation, a world state, or we have these states armed against each other. Now, the character of the national difference, of the difference among peoples, has changed in the course of history. At the outset, the division of peoples was entirely expressed in tangible customs. To be an ancient Roman, for example, was to live according to the mos maiorum, the customs of the ancient Romans. In other words, the national difference was tangible and it was expressed in tangible custom. The national difference is now developing in the direction of becoming something radically different from what it was under this earlier arrangement. It is becoming a form of moral specialization within mankind. The different peoples and nations of the world represent different ways of being human. Along the way, from the divergence of customs to the moral specialization, 2 incidents happen which deserve our attention. First, at the time of the French Revolution, modern nationalism emerged as an idea, as a project. It was the project especially of these armed states, convincing the peoples through war and through public schooling to embrace this notion of the nation and of the national difference. The second incident that occurred along the way that became connected to that first incident was the gradual evisceration of these tangible collective identities. As I said, they had been concrete, expressed in concrete customs, and these tangible identities were hollowed out. Why and how they are hollowed out is illustrated by an event such as the Japanese Meiji Restoration in the middle of the 19th century. The different peoples of the world are competing with one another, or the states that govern them are competing with one another. And for the sake of survival, independence, and triumph in this competition, for the sake of power and prosperity, they come to the altar of this worldwide emulation and they tear out parts of themselves and adapt or imitate arrangements imported from other countries in order to survive. So this is what the Japanese counter-elite did when it took power at the time of the Meiji Restoration and instituted the Tokugawa shogunate. It had to come and sacrifice part of what it was, and then to replace that part sacrifice by other institutions and arrangements that it imported from other parts of the world. And this process has ever since persisted. So nationalism is a deliberate project, a voluntary project of the elites, and its content requires the cumulative evisceration of the tangible collective identities. From that, there results the peculiarly poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. Two peoples live side by side, and they come to hate each other, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike. And they want to be different. So as the collective identities are eviscerated, the desire for national difference is aroused, inflamed, and becomes all the more ardent and dangerous because of its evisceration. When it consisted of tangible customs, it was porous and susceptible to recombination, imitation. To the extent it becomes eviscerated and abstract will to difference, there's nothing to compromise. There's nothing to recombine. It is only the object of an intransigent faith. And therein lies the peculiarly poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. Now I come to the second part of my remark, which has to do with the contrast between the two episodes of globalization. In the recent history of humanity, globalization has come twice. It came first in the period between 1870 and the First World War. Then there was a violent breakdown of globalization between the wars. And then it came again after the Second World War, picking up speed, accelerating after 1971, when the dollar went off the gold standard. It cannot be said in some simple aggregate way that the second episode of globalization has gone further than the first. It has gone further in some ways, but not in others. So net capital flows now in the second episode of globalization are smaller than they were in the first episode, even though gross capital flows may have been larger then than they became now. Trade flows have only recently become larger than they were then, and migratory flows remain much, much smaller now than they were then. So there's no simple comparison of degrees or extents of globalization that would allow us to say that the second episode has produced more globalization than the first. Now, in what respect are these two episodes of globalization similar, and in what respects are they different? They are similar in two major ways. First of all, they both took place under the aegis of an idea of convergence to the best practices and institutions embodied in the example of the then leading powers. In the first episode of globalization, Great Britain and the European countries. In the second episode of globalization, the United States. But it wasn't just an idea, an abstract conception. This conception of convergence was enforced by the discipline of capital. In the first episode of globalization, that discipline was exercised by the gold standard. If a country disobeyed, if it rebelled against this idea of convergence, gold flowed out. There would be an automatic balance of payments crisis that would undermine the national economy and bring the process to a temporary halt. In the second episode of globalization, the gold standard is generally no longer accepted, but there are functional equivalents to it. So among the rich countries in the rich North Atlantic world, the functional alternative is what you could call sound finance doctrine, exemplified by the inflation targeting regime of the central banks. And in the developing world, among the large developing countries, the functional alternative to the gold standard in some countries, but not in others, is a proxy for the 19th century gold standard, a syndrome of policies, followed especially by the South American, by the Latin American republics, including, among other things, acquiescence in a low level of domestic saving, opening of the capital account, and consequent reliance on foreign saving, and on an idea of fiscal discipline to be realized by a constraint on spending more than by an increase in the aggregate level of taxation. But this discipline, this restraint among the Latin American countries is regarded not as a problem, but as a solution, because it supposedly ties the hands of national governments and dissuades them or immunizes them against populist autarkic adventurism. It is not true that all countries in the world have followed this syndrome of equivalence to the gold standards. Notably, the Northeast Asian economies, first Japan, then the tiger economies, and finally China, rebelled against this. And they responded to the same constraints of the international system, including the international financial system, in a radically different way. They refused to open their capital accounts, at least until much later. They imposed a forced heightening of domestic saving, both public and private, and they prevented foreign capital from penetrating what they regarded as the strategic parts of the production system. At the beginning, they preferred loan capital, and they only allowed the production system to be bought up later when they could be secure in their independence. What this illustrates is that it is not true that the established system of globalization imposes constraints that necessarily require as a response, as an antidote to a capital strike or to capital flight, the policies adopted in Latin America. The contrary is true. What this comparison illustrates is that those who obeyed were impoverished and those who rebelled were enriched, exemplifying the general principle that in historical experience, rebellion is not always rewarded, but obedience is invariably punished. Now consider the differences between these two episodes of globalization. So, the first difference is that the idea of convergence was much more clearly articulated in the second episode than it was in the first. It was codified, it was canonized in documents that were written out by the international authorities and the academic authorities and labeled as the Washington Consensus or the augmented Washington Consensus. And just as the idea of convergence was articulated much more sharply. So the resistance to it was also much more clearly organized and had a whole ideology behind it. The convergence was enforced by international coalitions, of which the most important was the G7, what is now described as the G7, the coalition of the United States and its European allies, and the Bretton Woods institutions, especially the International Monetary Fund, which attempted to impose the convergence as a condition of its loans. And the resistance to the convergence also came to have its international agents, like the BRICS organizations of the major emerging powers. The second difference between the two episodes of globalization is that the character of the International Division of Labor changed in between these two episodes of globalization. In the first episode, the linchpin, the fulcrum of the International Division of Labor was trade between the capital-rich central economies and the capital-poor but labor-rich developing countries. And that was the basis of classical trade theory. In the recent episode of globalization, this basis of division has become much less clear, because you could say that the commanding force in the world economy has become a network of productive vanguards, what we call the knowledge economy, trading among themselves ideas, people, practices all over the world, and established not just in the United States, Germany, and Japan, but also, for example, in China and in India. And the third difference is that migratory flows, the flow of people through the world and across national frontiers, is much, much more significant now than it was then. A striking difference between these two episodes of globalization. Now let me go on to the third step in my argument, which is to characterize the present episode by contrast, not to the earlier episode, but by contrast to an alternative that we might want for the future. So the present form of the present form of globalization, we could say that it is not just globalization in general, it is a particular form of globalization. And just as earlier in the course, we have presented an argument about changing the legal and institutional architecture of the market order, not just how much market, but which market. So now we can describe an argument about not how much globalization, but which globalization. The present form of globalization is developing according to the principle that the objective should be the maximization of free trade. The most free trade in goods and services possible, as fast as possible. But you could say, by way of objection, that free trade in goods and services is sometimes good and sometimes bad, whereas the circulation of people in the world is sacrosanct, because it's part of the process by which humanity becomes both unified and differentiated. No sanctity should attach to the objective of free trade. The objective should be the coexistence in the world of different development strategies and different experiments in civilization within a world economy that gradually becomes more open. That's the only worthy objective. Now, the second principle defining the development of the present form of globalization is a principle of institutional maximalism, by which I mean that in order to be part of the system initially described by the WTO treaties and more recently by the multilateral trade treaties like the Trans-Pacific or the Transatlantic, a trading country must not only adhere to the market economy, it must adhere to a very particular version of the market economy. A version which, for example, excludes under the label of subsidies all the forms of strategic coordination between governments and businesses that the countries that are now rich used in order to become rich, but that they want to deny to the latecomers. Or again, they must adhere to a version of the market economy that incorporates the odious regime of intellectual property developed relatively recently at the end of the 19th century, the patent regime, which has the effect of leaving many of the technological innovations of greatest value to humanity in the control of a small handful of multinational businesses. Now, what is the alternative to this institutional maximalism? The alternative is institutional minimalism, the maximum of economic openness, of openness to trade, with the minimum of restraint on institutional experiments in the organization of the market economy. Now, the standard objection, the traditional objection, is that the result of this institutional minimalism is an intolerable increase in transaction costs, diversity of rules among the trading jurisdictions. But note that we know for certain that this institutional minimalism is feasible because, in fact, it was a characteristic of the regime that immediately preceded the WTO, the regime of the GATT. And not only was it a characteristic of the immediately preceding regime, but it has for centuries been a characteristic of international commercial law, of the law merchant. The premise of international commercial law was that a law of international transactions could be created and superimposed on the underlying differences of legal rules and doctrines in the different jurisdictions, including differences in the law of contract. And the jurists demonstrated practically what one might doubt theoretically, that it was possible for jurisdictions with very different rules governing international transactions to trade effectively. That was the basis of the whole history and tradition of the international commercial law. The third principle determining the direction of the present form of globalization is the idea that things and money will acquire the maximum freedom to cross national frontiers. But people will be arrested within the nation state or in blocks of homogeneous nation states like the European Union. A radical contrast between the mobility of some factors of production and the immobility of another factor, human labor. There's no basis in economic theory or in the theory of democracy for such a radical contrast. And what is the alternative to it? The alternative to it is to say that people, things, and services should acquire together freedom to cross national frontiers in small cumulative steps, gradually, but cumulatively. Now, obviously, universal mobility of labor, radical mobility of labor, could not be instituted in one fell swoop because of its revolutionary consequences. It would overthrow every regime in every country in the world. So it would have to be instituted as a direction, gradually, with compensations to these countries that send people, especially send skilled labor for their investment in the formation of human capital, and safeguards for the receiving countries, which would have to have a spectrum of forms of reception of this labor: temporary work permits, long-standing work permits, permanent residence, and only at the end of this spectrum, full citizenship. So the question is, what should the direction be? And under the present form of globalization, the direction is this stark contrast between the treatment of things and of money and the treatment of labor. The fourth principle of the present form of globalization is it's supposed to build a free world economy based on free labor. But free labor, what is free labor? So as we discussed before, up until the end of the 19th century, the common conviction of the liberals and the socialists was that wage labor was an inferior form of free labor, retaining many of the characteristics of serfdom and slavery, and that the higher forms of free labor were self-employment and cooperation. So the alternative to this idea of a free-for-all with minimum restraints in favor of the rights of labor and the rights of wage labor should be that the countries in the world be able to experiment with their market orders in the arrangements and rules of their market orders in order to open the path for the ascent of the higher forms of free labor. This was the problem not solved in the 19th century because the defenders of self-employment and cooperation, of the alternatives to wage labor, were unable to show how these alternatives could be made compatible with the aggregation of resources at scale. Now, finally, I want to come to my remark about Danny's trilemma of globalization. So the trilemma, if I don't misstate it, says, take three ideas or three directions: hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, expressed in trade and monetary policy, and mass politics or democracy. You could say mass politics is a better category because it includes both the weak, low-energy democracies that exist in the world and the authoritarian statist governments that are the alternative to them in the present world. And it says you can only have two of these three. And the criticism, which he and I have discussed in recent years, is that this can't be true. This can't be true for the very simple reason that all three coexist now. What is hyperglobalization? Hyperglobalization cannot mean the total unification of the world in one form of the market order. Hyperglobalization can only be this tendency to convergence, which I said characterized both the earlier episode of globalization and the present episode of globalization. And here I make a detour for an observation about the role of this difference among countries and economies in economics. The division of the world into states with different rules has no proper economic significance in the present economics. So it's a brute fact, a contingency or an embarrassment. It would be better for the world to be a single economy, according to this view, because there would be much less transaction costs. Everything would be easier. And what this view, of course, disregards is the economic value of national diversity. And here, this then leads to a remark about one of the defects of economics, which we may discuss next week. So the present economics is centered on the core of marginalist theory, developed at the end of the 19th century, and is a theory of competitive selection, just as Darwinism is a theory of competitive selection. But what is missing from the theory is an equivalent to the second part of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which is the theory of genetic recombination and mutation, the creation of the diverse stuff from which the mechanism of competitive selection selects. What's the economic alternative to that? The fecundity of a method of competitive selection depends entirely on the richness of the material from which it selects. And there's no counterpart to that in this economics. Now, that relates to this discussion that we're having right now, because there's no account of the diversity of the material in this economics. And so the reason why the Hanseatic cities and along the Baltic trade with the Russian Empire is that they have different products and different regimes and different arrangements and different practices. That's the whole point. And that's the whole basis of trade and thus also of globalization. So hyperglobalization cannot be the institution of a world empire or a world state or even a world federation with the same set of rules about the market order. It must mean just this tendency. And if it means just this tendency, it is clearly compatible with the other two elements in the trilemma, with national sovereignty, typically without what I would call strong national projects. Now, what do I mean by strong national projects? Strong national projects are national projects that impose a forced high-level mobilization of resources, as in a war economy. So a war economy without a war. Institutional experimentation, a distinct institutional path, not just divergence, not just rebellion, but the determination to create another road. And finally, the translation of this into fiscal and monetary policy, the fiscal shield to national rebellion. That would be the alternative. And what about mass politics, democracy? Mass politics is neither the authoritarian or the weak democratic form that exists in the world. Again, what we don't have is what I called in an earlier class high-energy democracy. Democracy based on a high level of popular and organized popular engagement in political life, on rapid resolution of impasse, and on a combination of strong central action with radical divergence, with the ability of parts of a country to propose alternative models of the national future. So what we have then is this combination of the tendency to convergence rather than radical hyperglobalization, the weakened national sovereignty, because typically bereft of these strong national projects, and the low-energy democracy or its authoritarian counterpart. If we did have a high-energy democracy and strong national projects in the senses in which I just defined, the present direction of globalization would be overthrown. And we would have a different kind of globalization based on institutional minimalism, not on institutional maximalism. It might be in some respects more globalization than we now have, but it would be a different globalization. And in that different globalization, on the basis of high energy democracy and strong national projects, the three elements of the trilemma would also coexist peacefully and reinforce each other. So they do not contradict each other either in their present form or in the alternative form which they might assume under these arrangements. So there we are, and I think I'll make one final comment about the present episode, because you might ask whether what the United States is now doing represents another breakdown in the globalization, similar to what happened between the two world wars. It's clearly different because it's a wreck produced by one power, even though it's the greatest power, even though it's the major power. And it may turn out to be transitory, ephemeral, either because the United States retreats from its present position and undoes this wrecking, or because the rest of the world gradually learns to trade among themselves without the United States on the basis of its own rules and its own arrangements. Now, in any case, there would be a difficult and costly period of transition, but that's something else that could happen. Not without dangers, because commercial conflict in history is regularly the antecedent to war. But as Alfred North Whitehead remarked, the business of the future is to be dangerous. There is a silver lining. These perils and upheavals restrain our worldliness and confound the worldly, who are unable to change either the world or themselves.
Great. So I do think we want to take some time to talk about the current moment, what's happening today, just following on what Roberto talked about. But I'm going to delay that for a little bit by spending a little bit of time to partly to complement, partly to disagree with some things that Roberto said. And then we'll stop, and then I want to say a little bit more afterwards too. I mean, we'll stop and have a discussion, and then we can. But first, I actually want to make just a clarification. You've used the term convergence, and I just want to make sure that we understand that the term convergence is also used in one of the readings on the syllabus, but it's used in the way that economists typically use it, which is simply meaning convergence in levels of increase.
To growth, yes.
Right. So the way that, Roberto, you were using it,
I'm using convergence in the same model of the market economy.
Convergence in terms of the forms of institutions and practices. So I think it's useful. Now, many economists believe that convergence institutions produces convergence in levels of economic well-being. In fact, that was the presumption that Roberto has talked about our current era of hyper-globalization. That was the policy background to it. But that, of course, is an empirical claim. It need not be true. I'll come back to it. And in fact, your argument, Roberto, was that, in fact, we're more likely to get economic convergence in the absence of pressures towards institutional convergence. which is another
Yes.
empirical claim. Okay.
That the best way for humanity to enrich itself
Right.
is to pursue different directions.
And then, okay, so that was just a clarification. There's one thing, another point that I want to make that's was related to some things that I also wanted to get into, but we probably will not have time to talk about it, so it's useful to bring it up right away. And I think both of us believe in a world in which different nations or nation states have the room to experiment. And we want to talk about what will be a system, what is a regime of global governance or peaceful economic coexistence where that enables such thriving experiments side by side. So we agree on that. There's a part of that, and part of my remarks in the second round will be on what those traffic rules ought to be. How do we think about rules of global governance that actually enables? So in that sense, I think I'll just expand on some of your ideas, but maybe a little bit more concretely. But
And there's one issue, important issue that I skipped over, which is the monetary arrangements, because part of what's involved in this present episode is what's the future status of the dollar.
Right.
And I think there was already a movement underway to replace the dollar, and this is likely to accelerate that.
I agree. The part, and this was part of your comments in the first part of your argument, that I didn't quite understand, and I think it might be useful for you to expand a little bit on, is when you were talking about the idea of let me make sure I get the term exactly right, which was of moral specialization.
Moral specialization,
And,
yes.
so as I heard you speak about it, that the institutional experimentation would, both be grounded in, but eventually produce also a kind of a moral specialization. And I didn't quite understand what you meant about that.
Well, I think one way to explain it is by reference to the premise of classical liberal political theory. So the premise of liberal political theory, the crucial premise, is that there can be an order of right which is neutral, impartial among different goods. So the good is always sectarian, but the right, the impersonal right, is universal. And I would say no institutional order can be neutral in that sense, because every institutional order tilts the scales in one direction or another. It encourages some forms of experience and it discourages others. Nevertheless, and furthermore, the ideal of neutrality is always invoked in favor of its opposite, because to call the framework neutral is a way of immunizing it against attack. But nevertheless, the illegitimate idea of neutrality has a kinship to another idea which is legitimate and indispensable, and that is the idea that every institutional order should be open to a wide range of contradictory experience, and above all, it should be corrigible. We should be able to correct it in the light of experience. So contradiction and corrigibility are the legitimate counterparts to the illegitimate idea of neutrality. And what I meant by moral specialization is that each form of national life is a different experiment in being human, and each then defines the good and the right in a different way. So there's no impersonal right.
That is, I mean, I'm glad you stated it explicitly, because there is a widespread idea to which I think most of us get exposed much more frequently, and with much greater force, is the idea that national borders are completely arbitrary in a deep sort of moral sense, and therefore, barring practical obstacles, it's something to be eliminated
National frontiers are to be eliminated?
borders. Yeah, I mean, sort of borders that essentially segment our existence, our human existence.
Well, I think there's this question that if there's going to be this moral differentiation, this differentiation of civilizations, and is it just going to be like customs, like the French have different habits than the Germans, or will it mean that their life is actually organized in a different way? And if it's organized in a different way, it will take the form of institutions established by law and by the state, which has a monopoly of violence. And then the national boundaries are crucial.
I understand. So maybe this will take us a little bit too far afield. So let's step back from that question, because I think it goes deep to the question of whether the existence of nation states can be morally justified, or is just a practical impediment that we need to live by.
Well, let me. I don't think that the division of humanity into these sovereign states, peoples under the shield of sovereign states, will be forever, because I think nothing is forever. But it is the dominant present form of the division of humanity.
Okay. So there are two sets of things that I wanted to talk about, interrupted by, hopefully, a discussion about what's happening today that relates to both. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the characteristics and consequences of sort of current and former forms of globalization, and largely complementary to Roberto, but with some important differences, I think. And then I want to get back to the question of what does a model of global governance look like in a world where we're trying to have different national experiments live side by side. So how do we think about the kind of traffic rules that would then need to exist to segment these experiments, but without too huge costs? So with respect to the first, I think I do want to begin by emphasizing, this is the only slide I'm going to show you, that just to emphasize what Roberto said, that there are already had different globalizations in history. So it's not, our thinking about a different kind of a globalization in the future is not, a sort of a fantastic idea, because globalization itself has gone through different forms. Now, you distinguish between the 19th century model of globalization, the gold standard, and the post-Second World War. I want to make a finer distinction, and I think it's probably our only area potentially of disagreement, is that I want to distinguish in the post-war period between the arrangements that prevailed until the 1980s, and which, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call the Bretton Woods regime, and you associated that regime, in fact, with much greater room for policy autonomy for countries, from the period that I'm going to call hyperglobalization, that was marked by the creation of the World Trade Organization.
By the canonization of neoliberalism and all of the documents.
By the multiplication of free trade agreements, and on the financial front with financial globalization, that is free access to foreign capital markets, or freedom of mobility of capital, as being essentially a norm, a principle to which all countries should move towards, rather than being an exception or something that was not really required by. So I'm going to distinguish these three models of globalization according to sort of these five set of conditions or criteria identified by each one of these columns. That wasn't, I thought I was talking to you and you were looking all at my charts, so it's not.
I think you can turn off this light here. Oh, no, that's okay. It's not the light on the board.
I thought that actually the cover slide showed, right? I thought it was wrong. Yeah. So I think something happened with the inputs. There we go. Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Okay, so this is what I thought you'd be looking at. So there, on the rows are the three models, or three different forms of globalization, the gold standard, and then the two different versions, which I'm going to distinguish after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods and the hyperglobalization model. And the columns are sort of, aspirations. Think about, how did the policymakers and the technocracy think of these arrangements, or what is it that they were trying to achieve or not. So I think with respect to free trade in goods, I think that's sort of one thing that ran in common. Obviously, none of these three periods had full free trade in the sense that even under the gold standard, by the latter part of the 19th century, tariffs were rising and so forth. But aspirationally, the gold standard was one of free trade, as was the Bretton Woods regime and the post-1990s hyper-globalization. But with regard to capital mobility, I think this is one of the important distinctions between the Bretton Woods regime and the post-90s hyper-globalization, which is that for the first few decades after the Second World War, in fact, capital controls were an integral part of international economic arrangements. So John Maynard Keynes himself, who was one of the architects of the Bretton Woods regime, made it very clear that capital controls had to be a permanent feature of this regime, and his idea was very explicitly to open up space for monetary, fiscal, and policy autonomy, that capital controls would provide the shield for the independent conduct of monetary and fiscal policy by nation states so that they could respond to their own business cycle conditions, to the demands of aggregate employment and so forth. In that respect, the Bretton Woods regime was very different from the gold standard, where in fact, the expectation was in fact that countries would maintain completely freedom for capital flows and financial and capital flows. In fact, it was the crises that was generated by the erratic nature of capital flows and the sort of highly volatile nature of financial markets in the interwar period, which convinced Keynes that going forward in the Bretton Woods period, that you needed these capital controls to ensure that you wouldn't have the repeat of that kind of financial instability. But the Bretton Woods also differed from the hyperglobalization, where in fact by the 1990s, the free flow of capital was once again, it became a norm in the regime. Now, it was not regulated in quite the same way as in trade in goods, so there wasn't an equivalent of the World Trade Organization, but it was a norm that was partly sort of disseminated through the OECD, for example, which was that if you had ever wanted to become a member of the OECD, you'd have to have open capital flows. It was a norm instilled by the IMF in its dealings with other countries. And so it was implicitly a rule. Now, labor mobility, I think, as Roberto mentioned, this was a feature of the gold standard where people could in principle travel without visa or without passport, let alone visa. This was an expectation, but in the post-war period we did not have that. Moving to the fifth column, the presence of multilateral governance institutions, that's actually another interesting difference between the gold standard and the subsequent forms of globalization, was that under the gold standard, effectively the rules were not enforced by the presence of multilateral institutions like the World Bank, the WTO, or the IMF, or the OECD, but the rules were enforced by the dominant powers of the regime, so it was of the day, which was the Britain and the United States, so that if, let's say, a Latin American country would, threaten not to pay its debt, or impose capital controls, then you'd have gunboats showing up at their harbors from Britain or the United States, or free trade regimes would be imposed on China or on Japan or the Ottoman Empire by the imperial powers of the day. So the enforcement of the rules was very different than what happened after the Second World War. And finally, the rules that reach behind borders. I think that's an important distinction. And that's probably, in my mind, the most important, obviously aside from the privileging of capital mobility, the most important commonality between hyperglobalization and the gold standard, because both of them had the feature that rules enunciated or written down or internalized in sort of at the global level in terms of rules of good behavior would essentially restrict what countries could do, not just at the border in terms of whether they could regulate trade or capital flows at the border, but would also extend beyond the border. That is, they would have effect on their policies with respect to subsidies or intellectual property rights, as Roberto mentioned, or it would directly influence their monetary and fiscal policies, directly in the case of the gold standard, because of very strict rules about openness to capital flows and the need to maintain a fixed parity against gold, much more indirectly, but also very strongly under hyperglobalization because of the need to maintain financial discipline, to maintain confidence of financial markets, and to prevent capital flight if you did not run the right kinds of policies. So I think it's these. Now you might look at this and then say, sort of maybe Bretton Woods was not globalization. But if you look at actually what matters from an economic standpoint, which is sort of flows of trade or flows of long-term investment, like direct foreign investment, there was very rapid increase under the Bretton Woods regime in terms of sort of the expansion of the world economy, the expansion of globalization, if you measure it by the flows of trade and investment across borders. And I think it reinforces Roberto's point that it may be paradoxical, but still the case that if you actually allow countries a lot of freedom to do their own thing, the consequence may be somewhat higher barriers at the border. So it looks like transactions costs are higher, but because you're fostering an environment in which countries are pursuing economic policies that are more coherent, that are able to achieve social peace and political stability, as it was during the sort of few decades after the Second World War under sort of the sort of New Deal arrangements or the social democracy, then actually the consequence is a thriving world economy as well, thriving volumes of long-term trade and investment as well. So the causality goes from enabling countries to address their own problems to a thriving system of globalization as well. Now, so this is already just to say that we have had several different models of globalization, and I think it's important to bear in mind because virtually every discussion we're having about globalization today, including sort of the discussion around Trump's tariffs, which I hope we'll discuss in a minute, is really about framed in the form of, are we moving towards more globalization? Are we moving back? Is globalization dying or is globalization thriving? That really evades the central question in these discussions about what kind of globalization do we actually want, that you can have very different types of globalization. And return to hyperglobalization, even if it were politically feasible today, is not necessarily the only option that we have. So the question is, of course, what are those different forms of globalization, and what does the Trump administration's image or sort of vision of that globalization?
Implied in something you just said is a very important point, connecting what we're discussing now to what we discussed in the first class about populism. About populism.
Populism, yes.
If the rules of globalization are part of an economic arrangement that has as its consequence the dispossession and alienation of the broad working class majority, the whole construction may be subject to reckon later on.
Exactly. I think that's correct. And I think Trump is as much a result, a symptom of the collapse of hyperglobalization as he has turned out to be a cause. So I think there's two-way causality there. There's one other thing that I want to talk about before really stopping and opening it up for discussion, is how do we characterize the hyperglobalization period and its consequences in terms of its effects. Now, it is absolutely true that in the post-1990 world, that many poor countries did very well. Now, we've talked before that the domestic social and income consequences and labor market consequences in the advanced countries, in particular the United States, was quite uneven, that there were lots of regions, lots of groups of workers that didn't do very well. We've talked about the social and unequalizing impacts. But what about the developing countries? Now, it is true that in this period, a large number of countries, probably the most significant of which, of course, is China, did extremely well. And some 800 billion people during this period, of which, majority are actually in China, sort of were lifted out of extreme poverty. This is the economic history's most impressive growth and poverty reduction experience ever. Okay? So there is a tendency to look at the post-1990 hyperglobalization experience and say, yeah, maybe some middle-class workers suffered in the advanced countries, maybe there were economic dislocations, but look at what was achieved. Okay? Now, so it's very important to really appreciate who the beneficiaries of this globalization were and what is it that they actually did. Now, what that characterization, the one that I've just summarized as hyperglobalization lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty, what that characterization misses is that the countries that actually engineered that poverty reduction, and China most clearly, did not play by hyperglobalization rules. China's policies were actually more akin to the policies that countries were enabled to do under Bretton Woods than under hyperglobalization. Because China did not pursue, or at least pursued strategic free trade, so that there were only segments of the economy were opened up to free trade. China never opened up its capital account, always managed its currency, features that you were expected to do and were allowed to do under Bretton Woods, but not under hyperglobalization. China, of course, violated intellectual property rights, something you could do under Bretton Woods, but not under hyperglobalization. China maintained huge amount of subsidies in state enterprises. China actively pursued an industrialization project, many elements of which, whether it's subsidies or industrial policies or macro policies with respect to currencies and the external capital account, that were characteristics of the Bretton Woods era rather than the characters of hyperglobalization. So the paradox of this incredible economic record of the post-1990s is that it wasn't countries that lived by those rules that did the best. If you want to look at sort of an example on the other side, which is the countries that tried to live by the hyperglobalization rules, but did relatively poorly, it would be mostly Latin American countries, because after sort of the Washington Consensus was really a description of what Latin American governments were doing at the time. And you look at a country like Mexico, and you find that literally Mexico, sort of was, I'm sorry?
Signed on the dotted line?
Signed on the dotted line. I mean, their whole growth strategy was globalization. And they were probably the best positioned country to benefit from hyperglobalization because they're right south, they're right next to their largest market. And they signed a free trade agreement, NAFTA, with the United States, which gave them privileged access. And productivity growth in Mexico during the whole NAFTA period was zero, or actually negative. It's a remarkable disappointment in terms of what its effect would be. I would, let me just one more sentence. I would link Mexico's failure and China's success during this period to the fact that China had an internal development project to couple to its globalization strategy, which was also very strategic, whereas Mexico had a globalization strategy, attract foreign investment, sign as many free trade agreements as you can, be a good WTO member, but really didn't have a domestic investment or productivist strategy. And I think that's the main, I would say, the main difference.
Denny, your narrative illustrates another very important point, which I think is not generally understood, and which the Latin American governments never understood. And that is that the religion of finance, financial orthodoxy, counts only in the very short term. Because what was the country that received most foreign direct investment? It was China. It was China, the country that disobeyed all the rules, as you said, because
well, the prospect, I mean, foreign capital does not have an ideology, so they're
exactly.
going to go to where the
Genuflection to the ideology. The religion of finance counts only in the very short term. In the medium term, the only thing that counts is opportunities for profit. And if the violation of the rules generates economic activity, that's everything.
So, I mean, just departing from the rules doesn't guarantee success, because you can also depart from the rules and pursue very bad economic strategies. So one argument, in fact, that technocrats in Latin America used as to why
we can't have this freedom because we would misuse it.
We'll screw it. We'll screw up if we have the freedom, because look at what we've done in the past. We can't, we periodically bring, overspend, over-distort, and therefore it's better to tie
our hands
at the mast of globalization and not have the freedom. So it's a kind of defeatism, and it was very characteristic of the spirit. So I'll stop here for a second. We do want to come back to the question of what
the present episode means.
What the present episode means. I think we should have a discussion of that now. And then if there is time left also, I want to say a little bit about, what some principles of global governance I think might make sense, if we ever get to a sane juncture. But let me actually stop here and just open it up. I don't want to talk immediately about Trump's tariffs, but maybe we can do it through your questions and comments as to, what the discussion we've just had makes you think about the moment that we're going through today. So, yeah, Sam?
We've talked about the Bretton Woods period, as you've described it, overlaps in time with the kind of 1940 to 1970 kind of 30 glorious years period that we've come across in different points of the class. And at other points in the class, we talked about that period as, being marked by broad-based prosperity, pretty strong performance of democratic institutions in terms of governance. I'm curious if you see any interaction between the structure of globalization in that era and the kind of domestic internal performance in North Atlantic countries that we have kind of praised in this class.
I do. I mean, I do think that there is a relationship between the permissive external environment or the permissiveness of the external rules and the large number of countries that did well economically and socially and politically. So that includes, I think, Northern America, much of Europe. It also includes some of the East Asian tigers during this period and a few other countries. Also, actually, some Latin America, like Brazil did well in that period, Mexico did well, Colombia did well, not across everywhere. So I think, so that opened up room for countries to, for example, in East Asia, to experiment in industrial policies in a way that they were not immediately being challenged through trade rules or restrained through trade rules. It enabled Western European and sort of other advanced nations to maintain relatively high standards of living for their middle classes and their working classes, and very importantly, to actually protect those middle classes when they came under significant threat from imports. So one important episode that shows how this played out was in the 1970s. We already have countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, who've had significant increase in exports of garments This is how they're growing through the sort of export-oriented, but very heavily pushed out by their industrial policies and so forth. Now, this significant surge of imports into the United States and Western European markets, somewhat like the Chinese export surge of the 2000s, creates lots of social dislocation. What happens then is that the advanced countries negotiate with the exporting countries an arrangement under the auspices of the World Trade, the then GATT, which was essentially restrictions on these exports, but in a way that actually ensured that the quota rents, some of the income that would be generated by these quantitative restrictions would flow back to the sending countries. Now, it wasn't the ideal thing from the standpoint of the exporting countries because they'd much rather have had the ability to export, but they understood that continued export would produce worse protectionist results. And then the advanced countries, in turn, were able to shield some of the worst social and economic dislocations that this surge. Now, economists looked at this at the time and said, oh, the world is turning protectionist. But from the standpoint of the deeper principles of the Bretton Woods, what was happening was regime maintenance. You're trying to maintain the regime by taking a step back when you need be, because you're giving priority to your domestic economic, social, and political arrangements. Now, contrast that with what happens under the hyperglobalization with China, right? By the way, in the 1980s, that whole experience was played now with Japan. Japan becomes a major exporter in steel, in autos, a lot of, and then what the advanced countries do, and this includes, by the way, the free trading Reagan in the 1980s, he negotiates voluntary export restraints with Japan. Again, the same principle, that when trade gets too high, to upset some of our social and political bargains domestically, we'll carve out exceptions to the rules. That was the spirit of the world of the Bretton Woods period. Domestic social and political bargains came first. So that's the sense in which I think some of these social domestic political bargains were maintained. And some of the supposed derogations from the world trade rules were really departures, one step back so that you can actually maintain still what's important, which is sort of fundamentally, a belief in world economy rather than a complete sort of a collapse a la Trump of today. So after the World Trade Organization, all these arrangements, like the multi-fiber arrangement of the 70s or the voluntary export restraints of the 1980s, all these arrangements were made explicitly illegal. So you couldn't engage in them. And so what did that mean for the workers in Michigan or in Ohio who were losing their jobs to Japan? It meant that the only thing that, President Clinton or later presidents could tell them was basically, you have to grin and bear it. I think that is the root of, some of the political malfunction that we've experienced, the loss of support for Democrats, the fact that there was effectively no way that you could respond, or you didn't even think that you should respond under the rules of hyperglobalization. So that was a very long kind of now, I'll say one thing here about how sort of, the whole approach by Trump relates to this. Now, during this period, during this long period, one of the consequences of this period of hyperglobalization was that, let me put it this way, trade and hyperglobalization contributed to the deindustrialization of the United States economy. I'm saying contributed, because it wasn't the sole or even the most important factor. By far the more important factor was what we've looked at before, which is the nature of technological change. The fact that it was much more skill-biased, automation, robots, and that essentially displaced a lot of workers. The decline in industrial manufacturing employment has been constant. It's all around the world. It doesn't really matter much whether you have what your position in trade is. So it's much more driven by the nature of technology than it's driven by trade. However, trade had two effects in aggravating this. One, of course, is that countries that had comparative advantage in low-cost labor, like China, could gain market shares, and that aggravated, particularly in some regions in Europe and the United States, the labor market shocks of automation. The second was the whole trade imbalance, that alongside the increase in exports from China and other low-cost labor exporters, the United States essentially developed a very large trade deficit in manufacturers. And that also contributed a relatively small part of the industrialization. Now, the most coherent explanation of what Trump is trying to do, and I think that that's only one of the things because we've heard many, many different accounts. The only one that is halfway coherent, in my view, is the argument that you want to sort of, this is an attempt to reverse the trade deficit. Because the syllogism goes, if deindustrialization is the result of the trade deficit, is the result of Chinese exports and other countries, if that's the result of unfair trade policies from the other countries, then you basically impose on these huge tariffs on them. So, either they reverse these quote unquote unfair trade policies, or you basically put on tariffs to prevent them from selling stuff to you. Now, each of the links in the syllogism are actually false, empirically false. That is that, as I've said, first, the deindustrialization is not primarily caused by the trade deficit. Reversing the trade deficit is not going to do much for manufacturing employment. We've already talked about how employment in manufacturing is not going to come back no matter what you do because of the deeper changes are technology. Third, if you want to really do something about the external deficit, the trade deficit, tariffs would not necessarily solve the problem. You would need to really do something much more on the exchange rate, on the macroeconomic front, to change the balance between domestic saving and investment. Tariffs are very ineffective instruments. Fourth, I forget where I am in my list, but even if you were going to use tariffs, using tariffs to target bilateral trade balances makes zero sense, right? Even if you were targeting bilateral tariffs, right, the idea that you would calibrate those tariffs on the size of the trade deficits makes zero sense. So I think the whole thing is to my mind just makes no sense whatsoever. Now, so I think the vision, if you ask yourself the question, we've talked about different globalizations. What is the vision of those people in the administration who are thinking of the next step, what's going to happen? What's their vision of the U.S. economy? I think they want one where the trade is much more balanced. Okay? They realize that to get trade that's more balanced, that they need to find ways of making the dollar, frankly, less desirable, because the mirror, the counterpart of the trade deficit is a surplus on the capital account. What maintains the trade deficit is financial investment by the rest of the world in U.S. assets, in U.S. dollars, right? So the trade deficit may be due, many economists would argue, not to unfair trade practices elsewhere, but it might be due to the fact that investors in Asia and Europe see the United States as a safe haven. So they invest, they put money in the U.S. The U.S. benefits from that because it's able to keep its interest rate lower and has the benefit of flows from the rest of the world. Never mind it's used for consumption rather than investment, but that's part of the problem. But that as long as the U.S. is viewed as a safe haven, you have this flow that essentially keeps the dollar more expensive than it would be otherwise because people demand the dollar. The dollar appreciation should then produces the trade deficit, which is the counterpart of the financial account surplus. Okay? So in that view of the world, then you basically have to find a ways of engineering a dollar depreciation, and that the only way you can do it by making the dollar less desirable, making the U.S. less of a safe haven, and by ruining U.S. reputation. I guess that's one way of doing that. But other than that, there's really no grand vision as far as I can figure out in terms of what the world economy ought to look like. But it's one where the United States has a smaller deficit, which requires less financial flows into the U.S. and more depreciated dollar. David?
So, I think going back to populism, there's this question in one of the readings in 2018, I think you wrote about why the populists were not targeting, they were targeting more trade issues than automation and technology changes. Has your view on that changed? Do you think populists on the right and left are targeting that more? Or do you think it's still the same, and why in that sense?
So yeah, I did argue, and it remains a bit of a puzzle to me as to why, I mean, let me back up here. Arguably, financial globalization has done much greater damage to the middle classes and the lower middle class in the United States than trade globalization. Because as I said, most of the deindustrialization and the erosion of the middle class has been driven by domestic policy changes and automation rather than by trade. Whereas, in terms of financial globalization, the global financial crisis, the mortgage crisis, financial stability has been very much a direct product of financial globalization. So I don't know why exactly. I mean, there have been some populist strains like Occupy Wall Street and so forth that has taken direct aim at the financial sector. But I think one reason is that until very recently, and probably to this day, sort of the Wall Street has had very close links with the Democratic Party. So I think in terms of where the money comes, in terms of support for the Democratic Party, it's a very strong, financial link. It's sort of like, the role that the tech world plays together today with the Republicans, except that in the case of Democrats, it's much goes, I think, further back. So I don't have a very good answer. So it is a bit of a, but the same reason also holds, I think, in Europe, which is clear because Europe obviously paid a big price in terms of fiscal austerity from the Euro crisis, and there hasn't been a big blowback against financial integration in Europe. Yeah.
Also on populism, in your paper, you discussed the case of Latin America, and I think it's like from 6-7 years ago. So how would you, from today's perspective, look at Latin America with that same framework, given that right-wing populists are way more successful than they were at the time?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think there has been much greater success of right-wing populists since that time. I would say, I don't know. I wonder
What right-wing populists? Because
Bolsonaro would be.
What right-wing populist in the world has pursued the project of a popular capitalism? I mean, look at Spain or look at the European countries. There's no program of popular capitalism there. So the concept of popular capitalism is mysterious. What is its programmatic content? I can see its programmatic content as restraints on immigration, but that's practically all. And with respect to production, what is the project?
I don't think they claim to have a productive project. I think the productive project is probably just to appeal to what you would call the petty bourgeoisie. On the
But how? By appeal by what?
By we're going to get the state off your back. We're going to make sure that there is enough access to finance, credit, but very.
It seems to me that the obvious program for a popular capitalism in these places in Europe or in Latin America would be, let's promote the small-time entrepreneurs, small and medium-sized business. No one has done that. Why? It's a mystery.
Yeah.
Danny, could you restate the question? Because I don't think people in the back were.
So two questions. One is what would I advise developing countries, especially today, as they were on their, on the prospects of an export industrialization strategy in particular, if given the Trump's tariffs. And the second question, is it possible to bring back manufacturing jobs to the United States? So on the first, I really think that export-oriented industrialization had run out of steam. Even the countries that, again, I'll go back to Mexico. I mean, Mexico today is obsessed by reasserting their access to the Mexican, to the North American supply chains. That's the number 1, 2, and 3 priority of the Mexican government, to do anything. The reality is that when they had the best access to the North American supply chains, in other words, when NAFTA was in place, they did so poorly, the economy as a whole. Of course, there were factories up in the north did well, but there was tiny enough part of the economy that became unintegrated, was not integrated with the rest of the economy. So they didn't do well. So, I mean, the idea that you would want to return to recreate a model that wasn't working for the mass majority of Mexicans, that seems, and that's a country that had the best advantage already to begin with. So you look at other countries that were, like Ethiopia was a country with, very significant labor cost advantage that really courted Chinese investors and so forth, and it didn't really get anywhere. Now, it's true that there are some countries along the sort of East and Southeast Asia. I mean, I think Vietnam is a great example. Cambodia has done reasonably well in exports as well. And so they did well, and they're going to be hurt very badly by these tariffs. I mean, very, very badly. But for the vast majority of countries, that wasn't the way to go anyhow, if they had not already built Vietnam-like, sort of manufacturing facilities. So what is the route going to be? It's going to be services necessarily. I say necessarily because agriculture, will not be a labor-absorbing part of the economy. And you need to increase productivity, but agriculture will never, will always, release labor rather than absorb labor. And it has to be labor-absorbing services. So these are what I would call sort of middle-class services, retail, care, variety of personal community services, and so forth. And I think that the urgent task for development strategy in low and middle income countries today is actually to work on how you can productively upgrade those. So, in those labor absorbing services. So in a way, the challenge of the advanced countries and the challenge of these low and middle income countries is quantitatively different because the numbers are different and the advanced countries have more resources, but qualitatively it's the same. It's just, working. It's about how you're going to, generate more productive, better jobs for the vast majority of people who are not going to be absorbed into labor, into manufacturing. And in the case of, low and middle income countries are being released by agriculture and into sort of, informal, unproductive, precarious work in urban areas. So, it's what that strategy, what sort of productive, these industrial policies for services, I would call them, for these middle class, mostly home market oriented services looks like is, I think it's a kind of it's a portfolio of different kinds of things that partly is about using technology to augment the skills and the kind of tasks that people can perform in those things, partly working with existing larger companies like big retail chains or big platform companies, to incentivize them to bring more domestic suppliers, more domestic workers into their supply chains. But it's a very different type of industrial policy than we think of when we think about export-oriented industrialization, which is externally oriented. So I think I've answered your second question, which is that I don't think manufacturing. I mean, China lost, in the last decade, more manufacturing workers than exist in the United States as a whole. I mean, and it's not like China became less competitive in manufacturing. If anything, it became more competitive. But the way you do it is actually by, automating and increasing use of, capital and skills. And so, you're not generating jobs in manufacturing anymore. That's the case for the countries that are doing the best in manufacturing. So that's, in its dreams, the United States would like to become a China in manufacturing, or a South Korea in manufacturing, or a Germany maybe. But all those countries have shed workers in manufacturing, so it's not going to bring those jobs back.
Some of the chocolate places are talking about more manufacturers coming back to the U.S. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, that's, you can, in fact, manufacturing has not, in terms of value added and output, hasn't done that badly, even in the last 4 or 5 years. So actually, if you look at the numbers, manufacturing as a share of GDP, in terms of value added, has basically stopped falling. And you could even, bring that up a little bit. You could. But, and there might be good reasons why you would want to do it because of national security reasons, for supply chain resilience reasons, for innovation reasons, right? Not for jobs reasons. And if you had those other objectives for bringing manufacturing production, not employment, back to the US, tariffs are a very ineffective way of doing it, because you want to do it through industrial policies that are specifically targeting those sectors, that are specifically asking what are the obstacles to bringing those parts of the supply chain back to the US, providing the kind of cross-sectoral, collaborative, iterative types of productive development policy that we've talked about in the past. All that tariffs do is just raise some prices. The link from that to the increase in investment and capacity and innovative ability is so indirect. Not to mention that you created so much uncertainty in the system that who in his right mind would be investing, make any investment in capacity when you don't know when the tariffs are going to be, tomorrow, let alone, 3, 5 years from now.
I hope it's on. I want to ask a quick question about something that you touched on briefly about the U.S. kind of starting to maybe get cut out of international systems or international trade. So I just wanted to, ask your opinions on the feasibility or the possibility of that happening, and what I guess that would entail, or what that could look like for the global economy.
I mean, I think the damage that the U.S., even if there's now talk about some of the there's a temporary pause on these tariffs and so forth, and I do think that the tariffs were so badly received that there's a real chance that there might be a temporary pause on the tariffs. But I think even that happens, that the U.S. administration, the current administration, has ruined the reputation of the U.S. to such extent. I think that this is a drastic, radical shift that both China and the European Union were doing sort of the clear. So I think they're making some very clear decisions to go ahead in a world as if the United States didn't exist. So just to think, of course, there'll never be such a world. The United States will never become an autarkic country and always remain a relatively large part of the world economy. But it helps to focus our mind on sort of what the nature of the changes that are going to happen. So I think the dollar is going to lose its luster. So the the risk premium advantage that the U.S. had, the U.S. financial markets had, will go. That might be kind of a benefit for Europe, because I think it'll mean that that Europe will have access to much greater financial resources at lower interest rates. That's both an opportunity and a potential problem in the sense it's an opportunity because they can use these financial resources to do a lot more investment of the type that they need. So it could be an opportunity for reflation. On the other side, as I was talking before, a larger, sort of European current account deficit on the whole, which will be required if you have a lot more financial resources coming in, means that there will be bigger, more demand for protection in Europe for enterprises that will be hurt by an appreciating euro. And therefore, there will be demands for sort of, putting up barriers and trade barriers in Europe against China. So the big question mark in my mind is whether the European Union and China can work out a bargain where essentially they'll understand, okay, there's about a kind of a $600 billion trade surplus that needs to be reallocated, right? Half of that was European trade surplus with the United States. The other half is China's trade surplus with the US, right? Imagine that that's disappearing because, essentially the US is killing itself, making itself poorer and making it less trustworthy partner, and the dollar will collapse, US interest rate will rise. And how do you reallocate that $600 billion trade surplus annually? And there'll have to be an agreement to how to manage this. If you leave it to the markets, I think we're going to have a version of this trade war that's going to spill over to China's relations with the European Union. So I'm hoping that there will be enough leadership on both sides to see that, okay, we need to live in a world where the U.S. is hurting mainly itself, but has hurt us. But the immediate need is just how do we reallocate this surplus amongst ourselves? Anybody who hasn't spoken? David?
Do you see this then as an opportunity for regional so-called powers like Brazil and others to take advantage and regional blocks that in South America fail miserably to become more relevant in the world stage? That's also a question as well.
Well, I think the problem is what's on the Brazilian side, right? Brazil has to have a project. So this would be a world full of opportunities if we had a project. For the moment, we don't have one. So there are no opportunities. I mean, we could, there are all sorts of projects we could have. We could have the project of feeding a large part of the world, empowering the Brazilian agriculture, creating a new style of sustainable agriculture, transformations like the substitution of low-intensity cattle grazing. I think I mentioned this, right? When I discussed briefly the center-west of Brazil, the main activity in the country is low-intensity cattle grazing. A large part of the country is degraded pasture land. We could triple our agricultural output in a relatively small time and feed a large part of the world. And then we would have to have a project of putting this mass of small-scale entrepreneurs on the road to cumulative productivity, a version of the knowledge economy. But these are ideas that are missing. That's what I think, right?
I agree. I mean, I do think that these sort of middle powers have a very important role to play because I think the space has opened up to them, I think. But what the role they play still seems, so, think about BRICS, for example, which...
I mean, because I go back to Brazil, the dominant power now in Brazil is finance. The finance companies have bought up the media. They dominate the public discussion. They're not interested in any of this. They make vast profits. What's going to stop them? So there has to be a political struggle and an ideological struggle before we get to having a productivist project.
I would add that I think these middle powers also have to demonstrate themselves as potentially as models of good governance, by which I mean sort of more democratic, open regimes. Because I think there was a risk that the BRICS was turning into a kind of a club of autocracies. And I think that sort of delegitimizes the project. Obviously makes it not a particularly popular one. So I think there is the economic project, but I think also that it's important for these countries to demonstrate that they're committed to democracies. I want to say, we don't have much time left, but I do want to say a few things that, you know, I said I would say at the outset, which is really about how do we think about global governance in a world where we accept that we want countries to have a fair amount of space for what is it that they're doing, for their own projects, for their own experiments. But yet we want some traffic rules so that they can do this in a way that they don't necessarily externalize their problems. They don't aggravate global problems and so forth. So I just want to say a little bit.
And there's another premise to this discussion, which is the failure of the United Nations system.
Yes.
Because
so
the United Nations system was supposed to be this
Right.
framework.
That is right. But the United Nations is a broader, a diplomatic, humanitarian, political agency. So because
But it deals with the most important practical
focus
problem,
only on the economics.
only on economics.
I will focus
But let's then remember that that's not the most important problem. The most important problem is war.
I certainly, yes, it's a problem. But here in this course, we focus mostly on productive inclusion and prosperity. So that's where I take my motivation. So I want to suggest that the question about how you think about global governance is actually it's difficult because the standard way in which we think about, let me try to step back here. What do I mean by global governance? Let me make a distinction between national governance and global governance and ask where should we put the dividing line? So what I mean by the dividing line is what kind of policies, what kind of policy domains should we presume that are rightfully left for national governments? Whereas what kind of policies, policy domains, should we aspire or expect that they'll be determined by global cooperation, by global rule setting, okay? If you want to put it concretely, what should be the domain, what should be the remit of a World Trade Organization or an OECD or an IMF, right? So that's the question. Now, from one standpoint, and I think it's the standpoint that we often resort to when we talk about issues of global governance, the answer seems to be very clear-cut. Since everything that we do in one country has, so many spillovers, they affect other countries, that we should always be cooperating, okay? But that's a kind of a very the focusing on the presence of spillovers as to why you should have global governance is not a very practical thing precisely because practically everything you do has spillovers. So let me give you an example. When the United States determines its highway speed limits, right? When it's 55 miles per hour, 60 miles per hour, 65 miles per hour, that actually determines how much people drive, how much oil they consume, and because it then affects the world price of oil. So we go from one sort of a domestic measure that's mostly focused on safety to its implications on world markets with respect to the price of oil. And then should oil exporting countries have a right to tell, or should we expect that the highway speed limits in the United States should be determined as part of a global rulemaking process in which oil exporting countries get to have a say. Now, that seems completely counterintuitive to us, yet that's the kind of implication that a argument that spillover is an argument for global cooperation would take us to. And you can run through a whole, like our local education policies, right? Local education policies affect the formation of human capital. The formation of human capital affects your comparative advantage. Therefore, it's going to affect the terms of trade of foreign countries. So should local education policies in Cambridge, Massachusetts, should they be determined in a global forum? So that, again, doesn't make sense, right? There's something that intuitively, right? So that's why I think simply focusing on this very intuitive notion that, since what countries do affect each other, there should be more global governance, which is essentially the tenor of almost every conversation on global governance, is really, internally inconsistent. So I would focus on two areas. One is areas where there are clear global public goods. The second area is where there are a country's policies are clear beggar thy neighbor policies, okay? Now, both of these things are actually fairly narrow definitions and they have clear analytical content. So global public goods refers to domains where actually what you do doesn't necessarily benefit you, it benefits the whole world, and you cannot actually exclude anybody from those benefits, and the benefits are not rivalrous. That is that you cannot, basically every country benefits equal amounts. So the archetypal example of this is global warming, right? Which is the notion that, the carbon you emit into the atmosphere, right, affects everybody's climate change, and vice versa. So that there is, in fact, with all global public goods, there's a very strong argument for free riding, right? No country wants to pay the cost of curbing emissions. They want other countries to pay those costs. It's actually very, and again, in the vernacular, we often talk about the world economy as if it was an endless stream of global public goods. But in fact, very few policies are global public goods in the true economic sense of the world, with carbon emissions being a clear exception. So when people talk about, for example, openness to the world economy or macroeconomic, and financial stability in large countries, that's not a global public good. Countries have to do that for their own good. Yes, it provides benefits to other countries as well, but there is no incentive to free ride. So the global financial crisis was not the result of the United States failing to provide the global public good of financial stability. It was the result of the United States failing its domestic governance because it did not provide adequate financial stability, right? So many things that we actually think as being global public goods or failures of global governance are actually failures of national governance. And it's not clear by having global goods you can actually fix national failures of governance, because often, as we were discussing before, those global rules might also then curb desirable local policy, desirable national, right? And then the question of who becomes the better judge of what's the appropriate policy is probably much better to leave it at national democracies rather than to global bureaucracies. So global public goods, I would say, is sort of one, but relatively narrow sort of set of policies. The other are beggar thy neighbor. Beggar thy neighbor, again, we use them in the vernacular in a very general sense, that anything that I do can hurt other people. But actually, the narrow analytical concept of beggar neighbor is much narrower. It's policies where I derive a benefit only by hurting others, right? So if I do something and the benefit I derive is actually the result of my hurting somebody else, that's a beggar thy neighbor. So when Trump says, I'm going to put tariffs with the explicit purpose of hurting my trade partners, that's beggar thy neighbor. But when you put on tariffs, let's say as you did under the multi-fiber arrangement in the 1970s, right, not to hurt your trade neighbors, but to actually protect your own workers or your own regions that have been adversely affected, that's not a beggar thy neighbor. It could be beggar thyself, because maybe trade restrictions are inefficient. But I think that's a very important distinction between policies that have negative spillovers. Are you doing those to explicitly derive some benefit by hurting others, or these are things you would have done regardless? That's not the point of hurting others, is not why you're doing this.
What about an initiative such as transforming the technologies of the knowledge economy so that they can be assimilated by the mass of backward firms and by the multitude of individual economic agents? For example, artificial intelligence, so they can be appropriated by the multitude. Is that a global public good?
That would be knowledge generation. It would be a global public good.
So.
That's right, because it would be generally beneficial to all.
Yes.
Yes, so that would be a global.
So I would put that close to the top of the list.
I think that's a good point. But with regard to sort of so let's say if you're putting restrictions on exports of technology in the AI, as the United States does, I think the distinction in the beggar thy neighbor space would be whether you're doing it to protect your own national security or sort of integrity of your communication system, or where you're doing, let's say, to undercut China's ability to compete. Right. So that's again the same policy might be one or the other. So let's just stop here. And in some way, we'll be continuing this discussion next week when we talk about the role of economics and how do we think about economics in this new era. Okay? See you next week.